sociology at GW as well.
I'm David Kyvig, emeritus from Northern Illinois University, where we actually have a Stanford-trained economic historian in the history department. I suspect because salaries across the university are equally miserable.
Arnita Jones, emeritus from the American Historical Association.
Anna Nelson, American University, History Department.
Jim Grossman, American Historical Association, and I have read and assigned enough of Gavin's work to know that it's not extinct.
I'm Richard Dashbach. I'm a history student, but I grew up in New Orleans, so my interest.
Drew Harris, attorney, interning in Congress, raised in the Mississippi Delta, so that's why I came here today.
Arlen Charles, Woodrow Wilson Center.
Marley Clymer, a retired nurse.
Allison Lilakoff with the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Brad Cady, no affiliation, just a local citizen.
Laurie Ann Hughes with the Faith and Politics Institute, and I also have a degree in American Studies and Political Science from American University. So,
Ben Gooderman, National Archives.
Great. Well, Gavin, it's over to you. The Civil Rights Revolution, who won, who lost?
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and it brought back wonderful memories of the great year I had here. Going around the table, Keith has been wondering, what in the world, what question is he going to ask? You know, what's the latest book we read or something like that? So let me plunge in on the chance that I may have too much material and get through it, but I need to say a couple of preliminaries. One is, this title is not the one that I gave out. I hope no one feels cheated by that. It's one that I used to give a convocation at Carleton College recently in Northfield, Minnesota. It seemed to work fairly well there, so I decided I would use it again. But usually I have the word "in the South" somewhere in the title, because the book manuscript that I completed last year here at the center is all about the South. And, of course, an obvious question to start with, why only the South? Surely the civil rights issues and the race issue generally had to do not with just the South, but other parts of the country. That is certainly true. And I could answer, I hope to say, not just that the South is my specialty. That would be a weak answer, but to say I believe there is a regional dimension to the entire topic that is commonly missed in discussions of the race issue in this country, which tend to take a national focus. So I'm going to be bringing out, in other words, the reasons for that. I should also say, since we just had this talk about the disciplines and the kind of specialty hybrid that I represent, economic history, yes, we do feel like an embattled subspecies always in danger of extinction. We had a whole Methodenstreit back in the 60s and 70s, and we, the economists, won with the result that the field is almost extinct in the history department, so be careful what victories you aspire to. But the reason it matters here, it doesn't matter too much to me, but let me just say two things. One is I operate in an economics department, and the questions I have been wrestling with in this subject area basically come from economics. And many times people coming from history or somewhere else can't quite see the issue, but in that case, I'll try to explain it, but that's part of it. Secondly, this is a work of history. I'm trying to talk about the economic consequences of the Civil Rights Revolution in the South in their own historical context. Of course, this is such recent economic history that inevitably we're led to ask, well, how does the story end? Where do we stand now? And is it still going on? And that kind of thing. And maybe we would, maybe we should, especially since this is the History and Public Policy seminar. But the first task is to talk about the revolution in its own historical context, and that's where I'm going to begin. Now, very often, people ask me this question, so let me anticipate it with one more preliminary, and that is, how'd you get interested in the South? And when I hear that, my true reaction is I want to deconstruct that question and reveal its hidden assumptions, and why are you asking me that? But I won't do that today. Instead, I'll answer the question. I got interested because as a college student at Swarthmore College, as was mentioned, I went to a small town, Warrenton, in a black majority county in northeast North Carolina called Warren County, on a voter registration project sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee. As a chapter of historical significance in the civil rights movement, this summer had no significance at all, but it had great significance for me because it's given me a sense of being part of a movement that had consequences far beyond what we ever thought was remotely possible in 1963. When I came back 3 years later as a graduate student in history to the Chapel Hill area, a revolution had happened, and we had no idea. Of course, we were just college students. But I think many people thought that things moved far faster and fuller between 63 and 66 than was ever thought possible. This is a picture, interestingly enough, one of our group, who was a college student from Carleton College that summer, has recently taken it on herself, knowing nothing about my academic interest in this subject, contacted me and has contacted the majority of the members of our group. She sent this picture of a baptism going on. You can see it gives you a real sense, the extent that one picture can, of a people with a culture and a sense of identity. We're circulating pictures of this kind from that summer of 63, and we may have a 50-year reunion. That's not what I'll be talking about, but it is something that keeps me going. Here's another thing that keeps me going is the local hostess for our little group in the town of Warrenton was this woman, Eva Clayton, and some 30 years later, she was elected to Congress and served with distinction for 10 years, and who could have imagined something that seemed like a fringe group beating our heads against the wall, against the culture that was never going to change. So that is going to be my theme. That is to say that there was big-time change, and big-time change in economic life as well as other kinds of life. And I won't try to track down whatever anyone has said about it, and I won't try to track down or guess about what you all may be thinking, but I'm going to be saying, well, let me use, I was talking to Roger about, I will use the PowerPoint mainly to show pictures and diagrams and tables that wouldn't be convenient, but occasionally I will lapse into the business school mode of using bullet points. But we just start with a list of questions, and maybe on the chance that I don't complete everything, I will tell you my answers. Was the civil rights movement about economics? My answer to that is going to be yes. It was about economics all along. Were there economic gains for African Americans? Yes, indeed, there were, especially so if you take a regional perspective, which is the perspective that I think is appropriate for what I regard as fundamentally a regional movement. The third question is a little less obvious. Were these at the expense of white Southerners? I'm going to be saying, no, they were not. Generally speaking, that's not the kind of thing you can pin down to the last decimal point. But broadly speaking, there were major gains for African Americans in the South, and I argue these did not come at the expense of white Southerners. In other words, it was a win-win revolution. But that leads us to cycle back, at least if you are an economist or you want to justify this, that if it was a win-win proposition, why was it resisted so strongly as indeed it was? The way I put it there is, was the revolution inevitable? And it was not. So when I say my questions are coming out of economics, this is the kind of thing I have in mind. Why was a system, the Jim Crow system, that with hindsight we can say was racked with inefficiency, why was it so persistent? And I think it was persistent and would never have changed without massive mobilization and outside pressure. Why the South? And then the last one is maybe one we can reserve for the discussion time. Where do things stand? Let's put that off. Now, on the first question, was the civil rights movement about economics? I'm going to answer it with one document. It's a document that I brought back from Warrenton, North Carolina in the summer of 1963. I realize you can't establish a sweeping historical claim like this with one document, but maybe one document is worth 1,000 words. It's a favorite of mine because it's using the language of democracy, citizens, all citizens who truly believe in a real democracy, to talk about economic representation. Why spend your dollars in any store where they do not hire any Negroes in responsible jobs? And indeed, that was true in Warrenton, this black majority county. There were no clerks that were black behind the stores. And yeah, they have in there the demand for fountain service. This is not really a youngish crowd here. When I speak to young people, I usually get to go, what is fountain service? They don't even know what it is. It means being able to sit at the counter. That's what the sit-ins were about. And, of course, there was economic content in that demand as well. But the point I'm making is it was almost always closely tied to a demand for jobs. Every school child now at least remembers the title of Martin Luther King's famous speech at the March on Washington, August 28th, 1963. But how many remember that it was a march for jobs and freedom? So I think the economic demands were there all along, sometimes mixed in different ways for the sake of public appeal, indeed. But certainly I had that powerful impression in Warrenton that summer, and everything I know about it since then is consistent with that. They were really looking for economic gains. So this scenario about it was rights, and then only later did Martin Luther King discover that it was really economic. I really don't think that is very accurate. Okay, so point number one. Let's start with the sit-ins. Greensboro, North Carolina, January 1960, often called the first sit-in. If you really read the detailed history, you'll find out that it's not the first sit-in. There were others, precursors, Oklahoma. You can go way back. In fact, when we went over to Alexandria while here, they claimed to have the first sit-in. This was the one, though, that took off, the one that launched imitators all over the South. And the first point I want to make, speaking from the perspective of economic history, is what was the reaction of a typical business proprietor to this kind of implicit demand? The first reaction was to resist, to not go along. The debate was over whether to wait them out or to arrest them. Business response was to close the fountain in the interest of public safety, or to lock them up, as in this picture. This picture actually comes from Nashville. The original picture came from Greensboro, but you'll allow me a little bit of poetic license for the sake of imagery here. Here's the point. A lot of people want to short-circuit the whole topic of the civil rights revolution because they say all it really did was to overthrow the segregation laws. The first two topics I'm going to be talking about, public accommodations, which, believe it or not, is a neglected topic, and the labor market, which is less neglected, but in both cases, people want to short-circuit it by saying, well, they overthrew de jure discrimination, discrimination by law. That is a very misleading statement because it implies that it was really a matter of segregation being enforced by law, whereas I'm saying public accommodations, segregation, was a business decision. The businessmen, most cases, most of these disputes, they had it within their purview to make a choice, and their choice was segregation, which they thought was a profit-maximizing result, for the simple reason that they thought they would lose their white customers if they agreed to integrate. Well, with great reluctance, once they concluded this was not just the latest summer fad, Governor Luther Hodges likened it to hula hoops, himself being of North Carolina, the owner of a number of establishments that were under pressure. With great reluctance, they came to realize these protesters were not just going to go away with the change of season or when they had to get back to class or something like that, and that they were losing large amounts of money because of the sit-ins and the association with boycotts. The losses took two types. One was the loss of black patronage, and the other was the loss of white customers who didn't want to go into some place where there's a lot of turmoil and disruption going on. So with great reluctance, they caved in. What was the result? Well, here's what happened in Dallas. Dallas was a relatively early mover in 1961. I put in quite a bit of work pulling out these figures from the Federal Reserve reports, monthly reports on retail trades in department stores. The Fed tracked these as a business cycle indicator, but they actually came in for quite a bit of attention in the midst of these crises. You can see they desegregated in '61, and department store sales took off as never before. In other words, it was a case where business was making what they thought was a profit-maximizing decision. They were actually mistaken, and they learned, at least in Dallas, they learned that the white customers were nowhere near as upset as they thought they would be. Now Dallas was unusual, and you may say not very representative. In that case, the mayor took a very strong position. They had a state fair, I believe it was a state fair, and he heard that one of the booths was discriminating, keeping blacks away. He called them up and said, if they do that again, they're going to lose their license. In other words, they had a pretty solid political consensus with enforcement behind it. So you might say, well, okay, Dallas doesn't stand for the whole South. Although, in fact, this account and a movie based on Dallas circulated pretty widely. Here's what happened in Little Rock. You may have heard of Little Rock. Scene of the breakdown of the school system, and you can perhaps detect some of the effect there in that dip from 1958 and 1962. It's often said Little Rock had a lot of plants, industrial plants coming in, and it stopped dead cold when they closed the school system over the schools crisis. But you might have thought they would have learned their lesson. But they didn't learn that lesson. The business community, their first reaction, like every other case that I know of, was to not go along, wait them out. In this case, they had them arrested. It was in January of 1963, after a secret committee meeting in the summer months of 1962. They agreed very tentatively and with great trepidation. And you get the atmosphere of how their perception of this was they were on the edge of disaster. And when they were finally about to go along with it, they made this kind of demand to the black negotiators. Look, we'll go along with desegregation, but during the Arkansas homecoming weekend, could you agree that the blacks will not use the stores in downtown Little Rock? I mean, that's how unrealistic their thinking was, that somehow some black leaders could decide that no blacks were going to use it. Well, however, within a few years, they found their fears had been unjustified, and it was actually associated with prosperity. People often ask me, how do we know that takeoff wasn't just the national business cycle? Well, yeah, it was the national business cycle, but here's a graph that shows you the volume of retail trade in the South as a percentage of the U.S. So we're dividing one by the other. And in that relative terms, in the general merchandise group, you can see that during the period of the civil rights turmoil, the first sit-in, 1960, the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, they were declining, and it turned around after the passage of that legislation. So there were a lot of white Southerners who were secretly pleased to have this happen, but they weren't saying so before, and it wasn't clear they really knew what was going to happen. So I've done some work. I want to move on to the next topic, so I'll try to move relatively quickly. I think by about 1963, this issue had changed its character. Most of the major New South cities, downtown areas, had made their peace with desegregation, and were learning, to their surprise, it was turning out to be not a bad business decision after all. And so you had the idea at this point, and the Kennedy administration certainly bought into it, maybe they could avoid heavy-handed federal legislation and do it on a voluntary basis. I mean, if it's going to benefit all parties involved, then why not make it on a voluntary basis? And so they were monitoring 566 southern cities. And if you're doing 566, you know you're talking about some pretty small cities there. And you can see the positive trend, theaters, restaurants, hotels, and lunch counters, but you can also see that the trend was somewhat sputtering out. In many ways, this idea they could do it on a voluntary basis wasn't working out. They were nowhere near 566. And also they were finding that a kind of partial desegregation without central enforcement is almost worse than not doing it at all, because then a black customer never knows where you can safely go or not. And the idea that you go in and ask and then find out is pretty unappealing. Pardon me? Yes, that's right. The left, the red one on the left is May 22nd, 1963. The last one is June 2nd of 64, or July 2nd of 64. In other words, just about the time of the passage. So what really happened? Well, let me move on to the next one. But yes, those are the intervening reports. There were a few more. At one time, they really thought they were going to be able to monitor this on a weekly basis. They were kind of falling in love with kind of record keeping. But still, to the extent that they were doing it, they were finding, hey, this is kind of working, but it's not really going to solve the problem. Here was a key turning point. This editorial in Chain Store Age, not my everyday reading matter, but I have taken to reading it while doing this research. He says that a federal law prohibiting racial discrimination in retail outlets would be helpful to retailers would seem to be rather obvious. He's saying this in July of 63 in a trade journal that has never commented on this issue ever before. He's saying it's obvious, but he says we could be making a big mistake here. That is, we might pass a law which limits its coverage to large-scale retailers or those operating stores or restaurants in more than one state. In other words, a limited law, which is what the Kennedy administration had in mind. Maybe only just within a certain range of the interstate highway or something like that. And he's saying that would be a disaster because that would give a competitive advantage to the still segregated stores that were somehow out range or not covered. If we're going to do this at all, we need to do it as completely as possible. So they were beginning to hear some of this from the business community in Washington. The business community was not leading the charge here, but they were not leading the opposition after about 1963. From that point on, I think it takes the form of a coordination problem. Here was the leader of the president's, chair of the president's committee after the triumph. They're kind of joining. I mean, these people certainly felt that they were a genuine part of the civil rights movement, that they were doing the right thing. It was good for business and the right thing to do. And he wrote up a report on here's the lessons, what I learned. Here's the kind of thing you can picture. One Southern businessman, or at least one businessman, talking to the Southerners as one businessman to another. He understands that unilateral desegregation would be economic suicide. He heard over and over that they would prefer voluntary desegregation, but he, Manger, could point out that he had his own investments in cities like Charlotte and Savannah. He was taking these risks along with everyone else, and if they all did it together, the risks would be much reduced. And this last bullet item there is especially interesting. He's saying he found out that Negroes did not crowd into public accommodations once they were given the right to use them, but quite the contrary, used public accommodations much less than would be expected. Now, James Farmer was at the event where he presented this, and he reacted very badly to this item. It is offensive if you think about it, but you can kind of picture a kind of businessman talking one to another, saying, look, it's not as bad as you think, in a kind of hushed tone. And I think that is why things moved, or at least this helps us to understand why things moved so rapidly between 63 and 66, the very years that I started talking about, because there was a realization that once you decide to give in on this kind of thing, you better have a comprehensive law because we don't want a fringe of still segregated competitors out there. Here's an aftermath. Once they give in on this and once they find it's good business, what's the next task? The next task is to rewrite history, including their own role. So this is a quote from Bill Chafe's Civilities and Civil Rights about Greensboro. I think 5 years later, this had split the community. 5 years later, the mayor is bragging about the fact that, hey, we had the first sit-in, as though we had invented the electric light bulb. I don't know. Should we be indignant about this? I have trouble working up indignation because I sometimes think, well, this is the American way, a kind of a feel-good business paper over the past, and let's get along in the future. Maybe that's about the best we can do, but it's not good history. And it's important to me to remember that this learning process on the part of Southern business, by and large, was something that they did because they had to do. It doesn't necessarily mean it isn't genuine once it happened, but so that is my storyline about public accommodations. And as I started to say near the beginning, you might think of this as symbolic. You might think of this as something only for the middle class, something like that. But of course, it stood for a much larger picture. Eller Baker said, this is about much more than a hamburger. It's about access to all the major channels of economic life. Well, that's chapter 3, perhaps. Chapter 4, I'm not going to cover them all, but the ones where I can extract a kind of a narrative that we can then toss around in the question period. Let's do the labor market. Here's a graph of black share of textile workers, South Carolina, 1918 to 1981. Why South Carolina? Well, because South Carolina had labor reports annually giving you employment by race for all the major industries. Textiles was the largest southern industry at the time, and I think the basic picture was not that different in almost all of the other southern states, which is to say there was no incremental progress towards desegregation over time. Certainly many people, many Southerners even, would tell you, well, you got to take a long view in the long run, industrialization, urbanization, modernization. That's the best answer to the race issue. But usually they were saying that in a context which meant, let's not do anything now. Let's do it sometime later. Well, the sometime later was right after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. You might want to thread the needle and tell me that it began to change very, very slightly before. But the big change came after. And then it was downhill. And in a way, it's going to be a similar story. Because I say the Southern textile managers, owners, firms resisted this. They didn't think it was going to serve their economic interest. They were not in there in Washington testifying in favor of Title VII. When the EEOC came down to Charlotte and held hearings, they snubbed the committee. I mean, they were resisting. Dragging their feet is an understatement. 2 more points. A lot of people want to, both in this as in the previous case, people want to explain away the whole civil rights revolution by saying, well, they're just overthrowing or overturning or finding a judge to overthrow the civil rights laws. This whole area was not regulated by law, almost completely not. And yet the degree of segregation was very extreme, as you can see. Males, black males, 5%, those were not machine tending jobs. Those were the outdoor jobs, the kind of crate opening and packing jobs and janitorial jobs. So women, in an industry that historically has been a major employer of women, black women were shut out almost completely, and that changed almost overnight. Well, okay, if it wasn't laws, how else can we explain away this revolution? See, I'm saying it really was a revolution, but I have to deal with those who want to explain it away. They say it was a tight labor market. They were running out of white Southern textile workers. Rowan, the Wharton School guy, said, yeah, 1970, labor market brought the change. It would have happened anyway. But you had tight labor market periods earlier, and they didn't bring down segregation. In the period 1900, 1907, wages were rising. They were running into shortages of labor. What did they do? They didn't start hiring blacks. They extended their recruitment networks farther afield to find more Southern white labor to bring in. Every careful study of this phenomenon rejects the idea that it was merely a response to tight labor market conditions. For example, and the Nobel laureate Jim Heckman is one of the economists who have studied this, but there were earlier studies. You get pretty much a simultaneous shift towards use of black labor, county by county in the South, in the textile areas, uncorrelated with the level of county-level pressures in the labor market. Yes, within a few years, they had changed their tune. By 1969, that's a quote from a New York Times article on this subject, virtually all the large companies here have begun to preach a doctrine of equal colorblind employment. But to me, to some people, it might say, well, 2-3 years, does it really matter which came first? To me, it does, because it's a difference in how we view the perspective. Are we getting far-sighted capitalist understanding here of what has to change? I don't think so. I think we're getting heavy-handed federal pressure And then when it worked out well, from an economic standpoint, they began to change their tune just as they did in the public accommodations area. Okay, here's another document. Textiles are getting a new look. 1960, there were only 3.2% Negro employees, North and South Carolina. 1966, it's been growing. How do you fit into the picture? This was a fold-out brochure complete with phone numbers and addresses. If anyone denies you your rights, you can call a lawyer. You might think this was a recruiting brochure for the industry, but in fact, it's a document coming out of the EEOC, the newly created agency you can see I found this in the Stanford University Library, but these were being circulated in large numbers. This helps to explain a puzzle that has puzzled Jim Heckman and some other economists. How is it that the very, very modest, limited budget for the enforcement agencies had such a dramatic effect? Well, it had a dramatic effect because you were getting grassroots mobilization. That is, and this was a genuine part of the civil rights movement, people following the progress of the legislation in Congress very closely, and the day after it passed, the boldest and bravest of them are going down to apply for these jobs, which they had always been turned down from before. But they're applying for these jobs in an atmosphere where the firms understand that if they just turn them all down, they're going to be in legal trouble. So a little goes a long way in an atmosphere like that. Doesn't mean it was all downhill. The accounts and, well, I'm going to, here, next slide. Oops, I went the wrong way. Here we go. Okay, I guess I'm repeating myself in that last quote there, but maybe it's just as well to repeat it. This comes from a book by Timothy Minchin called Hiring the Black Worker on the integration of the textiles industry. And there are many accounts in there about the rough times that the first black workers in textiles encountered. They weren't exactly welcomed with open arms by their fellow white workers. But this is a story I like. It's a manager in the Dan River Mills who heard an interview on the radio from a different mill saying these new black workers are working out all right. He said, well, that's a surprise. That's not what I hear. All the reports I get from the supervisors are the Negroes we have are shiftless, lazy, don't want to work, and leave as soon as they are hired. So at that point, he did what a manager should do. Of course, they should have done this years before, but they couldn't do it years before because they didn't have black workers on the job to study. When they did it, the systematic study showed no discernible difference in productivity. And I think maybe the bullet I was supposed to have there was another quote very similar. You know, after the fact, they found out that blacks can do these jobs, so-called unskilled jobs, but really they're pretty demanding. And they found basically no difference between blacks and whites. And then you get a situation where the company is essentially internalizing the value of improved race relations in that they want to at least, yes, over time, these companies certainly had an interest in making a success of the employment of black workers, but they're not the ones that initiated the process. Now, textiles is only one case. It's a somewhat special case because it had been the most complete form of segregation. In most other Southern industries, it wasn't complete exclusion of blacks. It was simply blacks being confined to menial dead-end jobs, like janitorial jobs, and with very little in the way of wage trajectory. So here from the South Carolina non-textiles, those same records, you say, yeah, there's a kind of a turning point around 64, but it's nowhere near as dramatic. It's much more gradual, and there was a mountain of litigation in almost all these other cases. It took quite a while of exploration and then some pretty potent Supreme Court decisions, like the Griggs decision, in order to expand those numbers. So you don't get an idea of a set of Southern employers who are eager to embrace desegregation because they want to get cheap labor or they want to bust up the unions or anything like that. No, they're being pushed and dragged into it, but then it turns out it's good for business. Here's a question, also comes from economics. Was the root of the problem management or labor? When it comes to discriminatory labor unions, we in economics have no trouble understanding that. Moreno has a 2006 book about it. Yes, unions want to exclude workers to enhance their scarcity value, and so excluding blacks enhances the scarcity value of white workers. They certainly were part of the problem. But management was part of the problem, too. And that is much harder for economists to come to terms with, because it really means that these profit-seeking capitalist enterprises were harboring views about the value of black workers that we now think were false. And they came to think were false, but they had to learn it over time. As an example, one of the first responses was not to kick them out, but when they realized they couldn't exclude any longer on the basis of race, they instituted tests. That's what happened in the Griggs case in the Duke Power Company. And the instigator there was also very much part of the civil rights movement. Yeah, they said, okay, we think black workers are just not as good as white workers, and if we can't do a blanket racial exclusion, we're going to do it on the basis of testing. And the Griggs decision, which is a pretty extreme intrusion into business decision-making spheres, was no, the burden is on you to show that those tests have a valid relationship to the skills that are actually going to be used at the job for which they're applying. Here's another quote from an older book about the Birmingham, Alabama coal and steel complex, interviewing managers after the fact, drawing out. He couldn't find a single case where any one of them had moved to break up desegregation for business reasons. They did not recall that the racial order created impediments or difficulties for enterprises. The point I'm making is this was a stable system as far as the business community was concerned, or most of it. See, there's a tradition in the economics of discrimination associated with the name of Gary Becker, wrote a book in 1957, The Economics of Discrimination. He said, okay, discrimination is a matter of preference. Whites don't like blacks, or don't want to be close to blacks, or something like that. And so you're trading off economic well-being for your racial status or separation. That is not what I see. Everywhere I look, you get resistance to desegregation, but it's not, people don't think they're indulging their prejudice at an economic cost. They think desegregation is economically threatening, and that includes these profit-seeking employers who are thinking that for political reasons they're going to be forced to take large numbers of underqualified, underperforming black workers, and they don't want to do that. But in the end, they had to do it, and by and large, they had to find a way to make it work. This is an interesting debate. It went on in the early 60s. Two different approaches. One group said, let's use voluntarism. The leading exponent of this was a fellow named Troutman, first director of a program, essentially a voluntary program called Plans for Progress. The first plan, each subscribing business firm would submit a plan which would involve ways to make progress on job opportunities for blacks. And the first of those codes was the Lockheed Marietta plant in Georgia. Well, Troutman was the advocate, and he made this analysis. He said, you can force business employers to hire blacks, but I'm a lawyer. If you force me to do it and I'm only going to do the bare minimum required by law, you're not going to get very far. It's got to be voluntary. Well, the verdict of history is pretty firmly on the side of compulsion. Both Troutman was forced out of his position, and the whole Plans for Progress approach came in for scathing critiques. It was only with EEOC actions, private lawsuits, and federal contract compliance that we got the biggest change in black employment, and the greatest gains came at large covered employers. And yet, despite this firm verdict of history, I think we have to ask ourselves, maybe Troutman had a point, that unless you can get firms to, in some sense, internalize these goals, it's not going to stick. So we have something, best term, not the most elegant term I've ever come up with, quasi-voluntarism. And learning, yes, Secretary of Labor Ray Marshall. There's something about the threat of prosecution that makes voluntary programs work much better. But it's not a cynical comment. He's saying yes, it's voluntary in the sense you work out the details, you work out the plan, And this Harvard sociologist, Frank Dobbin, has written a very nice book called Inventing Equal Opportunity. He says the real heroes of the civil rights or the equal opportunity revolution were not the lawyers, and they were not the grassroots activists. It was the human relations bureaucrats within these companies who found workable ways to make this happen. In effect, he said, they had internalized the civil rights movement so much so that when the Reagan administration tried to shut the whole thing down in the 1980s, basically business told them, no, we've got our system, we want to stick with it. So I think that's a nice analysis, and the one thing I object to is he doesn't explain or show how it was that the gains were greatest in the South, and indeed they were. So I would like to be able to pursue that agenda in essentially business history, but it's pretty hard to get business records. Here's one of the very few things I could get because you had an early settlement with AT&T. And there's an analysis of it by Northrop and Larson, came out in 1979. So this is very, very limited indeed, only 2 observations, and even 73 is pretty late in the game. Still, I think the results are striking. Look at the bottom line there, just to give you the easiest summation there. Total white collar, and when I say total white collar, I mean total black white collar employment. In the North, it stood at 33,199 in 73, and in 79, which was supposed to be after 6 years of carrying out their internal plan as worked out in the settlement, it was 34,483, barely changing. But the company as a whole had changed and met the targets because of the progress in the South. That's a big change from 13.4%, 16.5. Oh, maybe you don't think it's big enough. No doubt it isn't big enough. The point is it's a significant change compared to the past, and it's certainly significant in the South compared to what was happening in the North. And of course, the reason is not that hard to understand because no one admitted to using the word quota. But the kind of target was supposed to be based on a percentage of the local demography, the share of the population in the labor market wherever you're working, and the black percentages were substantially higher in the South than in the North. Well, I say I don't have business records, so let me show you the records I do have. From census records, I've done a lot with the occupational data on middle-class occupations. This is just a short stripped-down version of a larger table in the chapter. Professionals, managers, sales. I've also got clerical and skilled blue-collar labor. Charlotte, North Carolina. You can see that there were 755 black professionals. Even that number is perhaps misleading because professionals include school teachers, and you had a significant number of black school teachers. I want to do a better version of this where non-teacher professionals, and it's more like 2 or 3%. But whether you make an adjustment like that or not, the point I want to make is you get rapid growth in the number of blacks in professional occupations in a city like Charlotte, both in the numbers and in the share of the total. And you'll notice this was not happening in the 50s. It was happening in the 60s, and I think it's mostly happening after the Civil Rights Act. And furthermore, it continued on through the 80s, even with a striking change in the political climate and the legal climate. Most of this was not being enforced in some direct way by court orders, but it was happening. So that still underrepresented at the end compared to their share of the population, but 20% is a lot bigger share than 2.7 or 2.5. Well, you may think Charlotte is not very representative. It's North Carolina. It's a financial center. It's kind of a new city. Well, let's look at the opposite extreme. Birmingham, Alabama, a city known as having the worst race relations in the nation and where its industrial base was collapsing, even while its race relations were breaking down. You get a pretty similar picture. You get much larger percentages. That's because it's a black majority area and a black majority city. So the point is it's continuing growth in both numbers and share. And Birmingham, just to speak to the question of were these black gains won at the expense of white Southerners? No, Birmingham is a success story. It has remade itself as a university center and as a health research center. There are a lot of pretty decent, middle-class jobs in which blacks are well represented in a city like Birmingham. You may want to say, what happens, the trouble is, most of that growth has to do with the high black percentages, so here's just a point to underscore my point about how the regional dimension tends to get missed here. The black percentages of these categories are much, much higher in the South than in the North. And look particularly at those sales. Now, it's true that the black share was higher even in 1950 under Jim Crow. But there was no progress in the South on that one column in the 50s, and by and large, that's what I found. Despite all the industrialization, urbanization, modernization, communications, television, everything that you might want to point to, this was not generating job opportunities for blacks, and in fact, blacks were leaving the South by the millions during this period. It turned around beginning in 1965 in round numbers, and after that, you get significant progress relative. So these, much larger numbers of professional jobs and middle-class jobs, just for lack of a better term, in the South than in the North. Here's a graph of net black migration into the South. You can see the zero line. So all those negative numbers, especially between 1910 and 1960 or 70, that's the so-called Great Migration. There's a recent prize-winning book about that, which I have yet to read, although I will read it. The only thing I want to object to is not the book. It's to the statement promoting the book that says, this is a neglected story in American history, the Great Migration. It's not neglected. It's in every textbook. The neglected story is that one on the upper right-hand corner, the fact that we have had net black in-migration into the South ever since 1970. And in the textiles areas, the turnaround began in 1965 because there were job opportunities opening up in textiles that paid a lot better than the alternatives. You may not think a textile job is a great job, but it paid about $90 a week, which is a lot more than the $25 a week that you'd get for domestic work. So African Americans have, in effect, been voting with their feet for the economic reality of the civil rights revolution in the South ever since. It's often called return migration, but it's really not the same people or the same group returning. These are typically people with college education or at least some education, and they're going back into the new South cities rather than the declining rural areas. And I'm interested to know it has persisted, right? That last observation there is 2005 to 2009. In other words, even in the very, very tough decade, sometimes called the lost decade, first decade of the century, blacks have still been moving south. That movement of blacks to the South has not been depressing their relative income. Here's a graph of median black male income. You can see how far behind Southern blacks were in the 50s. Also, they were getting even farther behind in the 50s before the early 60s. Maybe there was a kind of turnaround before 1964, but the big change came after 1964. So much so that by the end of the millennium, end of the century, the South was no longer the low-income region of the country for African Americans. Of course, that's black compared with black. If you compare black to white, they're still behind. But still, this is remarkable progress. In the 1950s, when the black line is slipping down, they're about 40% of the white line. Whites are enjoying or experiencing or capturing the gains from Southern progress. Blacks are not. It goes from 40% to 60% in the middle to 75% on the on the right. So this is part of my basis for saying the black gains were not coming at the expense of white Southerners. What was happening was, in the pre-civil rights era, blacks were being ushered out of the region. They had no integral place. And that's what turned around. It was not a redistributionary program. It was a reintegration of African Americans into the regional economy. And after that, you have periods of ups and downs, for sure. But the ups and downs tend to be the same for Southern blacks and Southern whites. So in a nutshell, that's my story about the labor market, where once again, business, it kind of changes your image, or at least maybe it's a naive image that economists have about the super efficiency of business. But I don't think the business leaders thought they were trading off indulging prejudice for profits. They thought they were pursuing a profit strategy, and they found there was a better one. It was just one that they had to be pushed into taking. Why do blacks go south? Well, you know, I try to stick with economics. I'm not doing cultural history. I appreciate that you can't separate these completely, but point is, the interviews, the things you read as to why blacks are moving south, you do find lots of cultural references, family and cultural roots, some references to political representation, business opportunities, rise of black-owned business. It's underrepresented everywhere, but the growth has been most rapid in the South. If you can look at things like Black Enterprise magazine, you'll get reports like that one. 8 of the 10 best cities for African Americans in 2004 were in the South. So there are lots of reasons, but I think the reason behind all the other reasons is better job opportunities in the South than elsewhere. So that's what I mean when I say that the regional dimension has been generally missed. I just have a few slides showing you some illustrative backing for this. Here's a case study of a large retail firm where they had a lot of opportunities to observe white managers and black managers in the same kind of situation. And the upshot was black managers hire more blacks than non-black managers and vice versa. It's a bit chilling. It might not be what you really thought the civil rights revolution was supposed to have achieved, a kind of colorblindness, but it hasn't done that. But it has increased black representation, especially in the South, in positions where they can influence what happens. Why is it that you get this racial effect? Well, maybe your guess is as good as mine, but you have informal hiring networks that tend to be segregated along racial lines. You have applicant preference for same-race managers, and they even come up with some evidence of better performance with racial match, better performance being defined as tenure on the job, that kind of thing. They don't really have productivity. This is just a reminder that when I say there's a southern regional effect, a good part of that, I don't say it's all of it, but it's simply the fact that if you're using state data, and a lot of these things do depend on state-level demography, the states with highest percentages of black population are in the South. You've got that, you might say the deep South, the dark color there, but then you have the areas bordering on those, which are also part of what I'm talking about when I talk about the South. Here's the county data, which maybe gives you an even more striking picture of the fact that the black presence in the South is very strong. And when people ask me why, is there still a South and what defines it? Well, this belongs on the list. The black presence is a significant part of defining what makes the South distinctive. Now, I'm seeing the clock getting close to 5, so let me try to find a wrap-up point here, or maybe just give you a clue as to the other things that I go into in other chapters. There's a chapter on voting rights, showing this kind of overnight effect on voter registration in the South. And this is distinctive to the South because as discriminatory as things were in the North, blacks by and large had voting rights. But voting rights didn't immediately translate into black elected officials. It took a good long time struggle and a lot of litigation to make that happen. But when it did, you get a lot more black elected officials in the South. Is there an economic payoff to having more black elected officials? Well, I've got a whole chapter on it arguing, yes, there is. Exactly how it works is subject to discussion. But I think there's a complementarity between the economic opportunities, the political representation, and the business opportunities, and this is all part of my explanation. I view it all as a consequence of the Civil Rights Revolution, which I understand as a regional phenomenon in its essence. So that's the essence of the story, and I think it would make sense for me to stop at this point and entertain questions.
Thank you. The floor is open for comments and questions. Done. Okay.
Thank you for that, Gavin. It's good to have you back. I'm remembering back in the early 70s when Nixon sort of championed something called affirmative action in the building trades, and that was concentrated on the North and the difficulties they had with the labor unions getting more blacks into construction. What was going on in the South at that time in the building trades? Were they, in effect, ahead of the North because of the lower wages and so on? Or I just don't know what that story was.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I realize I'm not going to hold up publication, but I will not have completed the job unless I really understand why things were so frustratingly difficult in the northern states, and the resistance in the construction trades would be an example of that. Now, there's a nice article by my colleague in political science, Barry Weingast, and our colleagues arguing, the very stipulations and terms of the Civil Rights Act of '64 very carefully avoided anything that would really target the North. That's how they got their majority and kept it, is kind of isolating the South. So that I realize that's not a direct answer to your question. I think the Southern construction trades were just as resistant, if not more so, as in the North. But that particular political initiative was clearly targeted in the South, and I think in the North. And I think the general reading, it made some progress, but it was a lot slower and more difficult over the decades. You didn't get anything like that kind of overnight breakthroughs that you see in textiles.
Thank you. Hope?
Well, I have a couple of historians' questions that may get at what you said, with historians not always getting the questions economists ask. You, at the beginning, talking about serving African Americans, showing the sit-ins, you said it was a business decision not to serve them. Because they thought if they did that, they wouldn't have so many whites and they'd lose money. How do you know that it was a business decision and that it wasn't just prejudice?
Well, that's interesting. You say that's a historian's question, but it's actually the kind of question that my young economics colleagues, they would want an econometric model with a test and say, how do I know it? I don't know it as rigorously as that, but I feel confident in that assessment from having dipped into the business press of the Times and read the accounts. In Greensboro, for example, there was a vigorous argument about how to respond. So it wasn't just the individual proprietor, the Woolworths. He was targeted, but it was being discussed more generally. And what I argue in the chapter is it's a business decision, but it wasn't just a decision on the basis of the individual proprietor. It was really the downtown business community as a coalition. They were afraid that if blacks were allowed into downtown in a kind of socially comfortable atmosphere, enjoying themselves in these hot-button areas such as drinking and, talking about drinking Coca-Cola and hamburgers, this area is going to become a kind of a ghetto. That was the analysis. We've got to watch out for this. It's as though we don't want you to give in on this issue because we're all going to be vulnerable. Now, the question is this a business decision or is it prejudice? Well, the calculation going into it is shot through with prejudice, this imagery about this place is going to be taken over by blacks. But I do think that was driving their business decision as opposed to just saying, we don't want blacks around. And part of the reason I say that is the national corporations. Their first reaction also is almost always, I can't get into their records either. And Liz Cohen says she's tried very, very hard to get into, all the major companies. Their first reaction was to support the local management. The national business leaders in New York were not being governed by these local social networks. In fact, they were made uncomfortable by the picketing and the bad publicity. But they said, it's our tradition to accommodate local customs, and, we can't change things overnight and this and that. And I just think if they really thought with confidence that it was going to be a profit-making move, to desegregate as quickly as possible, I think they would have pushed for it. And ultimately, they did come around on that, but that was the group that I think was very, very happy to have the Civil Rights Act passed because, okay, we don't have to take it on our shoulders anymore. So I guess maybe that's my main answer to that is that prejudice in the sense that Gary Becker used it, a kind of a non-economic attitude. I just think that's a wrong way to think about it. I think they were thinking about their own economic interests, but their thinking was permeated by, I'm trying to avoid the word racism, not because I don't believe in it, but because it kind of conflates the things that I'm trying to keep separate. But this image, both a sense of how their fellow white Southerners felt about things and would react, which they, in the end, didn't estimate very well, but they certainly believed in it. But you can't say that it's simply an irrational figment to be afraid that your patron is going to turn over completely and whites are going to avoid your establishment. And this, you find a lot of this. This is threatening my business and my life savings and so on. These are economic fears that I'm seeing every place I look. So that's how I know.
Okay, Hope, was there yet a second question? Or okay, very good. Jim, and then we'll go to actually over there and then over there. Oh. Hold on for the mic.
I have a bunch of stuff, but one other thing on the professional slide, by the way, is that it's not just teachers you'd have to strip out. It's musicians and ministers.
Ministers. Teachers is by far the largest. But
yeah,
you're
but the
quite
musicians
right.
and the ministers also are going to skew it considerably. And the unlearning prejudice slide, what's interesting, and this gets back to your issue of the business decision versus prejudice, which is a hard thing to do, which is, can you tell, my first question is, can you tell from the industry journals whether or not your industry people honestly believe that black workers are inferior? The reason I ask is that for the earlier period, for say 1915 through 1930 or so, it's very explicit. I mean, in 1915 and 16, they are saying hiring these people is really dicey because they're not very good. Yeah. And in 1920s, they're saying, hey, they're not bad. And they're actually saying it in the industry journals. So I'm curious if the industry journals show that kind of change, which suggests that the refusal to hire is based on sort of honestly believed theories about race and capacity. My second question, though, is a bigger one, which is, what happens if you move the whole first half of your presentation away from segregation towards white supremacy? You're suggesting that what's at issue is segregation. And I would argue that it's not what's at issue, that what's really at issue is white supremacy. I'm sure you're not surprised to hear me say that. Yes. That segregation is simply one small aspect of the Southern system at this point. And there's something much bigger at stake. And you can give up segregation without giving up white supremacy.
Well, that last one is a very deep point. I'm probably not going to do justice to it. So let me refer back to the first one. Honestly, believe I don't quite know how to get at that. I mainly looking at behavior rather than testimony. But what I see is, okay, well, let's take the Duke Power case, which gave rise to the Griggs decision. They institute testing, and I would think, these are reasonably well-educated managers, not all of them Southern in their background. And probably at some level they would acknowledge that, yes, this apparent inferiority is because of all these years of segregation and inferior schools, and they did talk about cultural background. So that may be a kind of a modern, sophisticated version of racism, but it's an honest belief. And so I think their image, and they thought that this would comply with the law, was, okay, we're going to institute we're going to give up racial exclusion, we're going to use testing instead, and from time to time, there are going to be some exceptional black workers who are going to qualify, and, over time, maybe things are really going to change. I think that's their honest view, that this was going to be very, very slow and gradual, and that would be accepted, and maybe the idea that it would really change in a deep sense of acceptance might have been a remote hope. But in fact, they were pressured to change much faster than they ever would have. And in that basic sense, I think it was contrary to their honest belief. And their beliefs really did change or evolve over time. But I wish I had a kind of objective way to show that. You don't find a productivity drag by and large, and that was certainly different from what they expected. So, no, the white supremacy is much harder, and I think maybe I shouldn't try to attempt it kind of on the run. I think my basic game plan here is to frame my questions as narrowly as I can in hopes of coming up with more or less objective answers. And what I understand from white supremacy is the idea that who's really in charge in this society on the big important issues, and most certainly you are right, that merely going along with desegregation of public accommodations, you say, okay, we're not really changing our attitudes, we're just changing what we will classify as a threatening kind of change. And to a considerable degree, the labor market change involved that too. So I think it would be a mistake for me to dive too far into the voting rights matter, but still, by and large, if you take the 50-year view, I think the South has moved a long way away from white supremacy as it was understood back then. But it would still be a big mistake to say kind of race consciousness has been eradicated, because it certainly has not. So it's been a kind of a move toward redefining, and that's at a pretty deep level, because I don't think this interpretation that what you really have is white supremacy that's been relabeled in a different way. I don't think that's a very persuasive interpretation, although I think it has its advocates. So.
Okay, gentleman over here.
I have a question. From a non-economist standpoint, the iconic civil rights event is Brown versus Board of Education.
Yes.
Leading the notion that courts, Supreme Court in particular, and some federal courts in general, led the charge. And that prompted a debate in the 80s and 90s about Gerald Rosenberg's hollow hope. That it really wasn't courts, it was really legislatures that led. Brown was a relatively minor move. Yeah. But there was a response to that debate. One voice was that it really wasn't either of those. It was really Southern businessmen who understood the economic downside to segregation, and that's what broke segregation. And I was wondering whether, as I saw what you were presenting here today, it seemed businessmen were more laggers than leaders on that. And I was wondering whether you had a view as to whether businessmen were leaders or more lagging force in ultimately breaking desegregation.
I think there were laggards in this area too. There's a well-known survey published in '63, although maybe it was '62. Business leaders, community leaders, what's their first choice, and what would they go along with if they had to? Their first choice was segregation, and they're mainly talking about schools at that point. But they understood they might have to accommodate. The court decisions were ultimately going to get serious. And so you got an acquiescence. And you might say at some of the later points where the communities were really threatened with revival of turmoil, and they had it. I mean, some business leadership after a fashion at that point, and they're saying, look, let's maintain law and order here. Look what happened in Little Rock and that kind of thing. That's in my view, that's a kind of laggard, second-rate kind of leadership. But I don't want to say it has zero content at all, and especially so as this slide, by the way, is supposed to make the point that ultimately there was desegregation of the schools, and the South had the least segregated schools. By this measure, but other measures too. Look at 1972, 1976. Desegregation mainly happened in the South. It began to happen in the North, and in the North you got court decisions like the Milliken decision ruling out cross-district integration, and so for the most part, you never got anywhere near as much school desegregation in the North as you did in the South. You weren't asking so much about that quantitative question. You were asking, well, what was the business perspective on this? Well, some businessmen were counseling at that point, that late point, 14 years or so after Brown. Let's go along. It's the lesser evil. We may not like it, but we got to go along with it. And of course, chances are they themselves and their children were probably escaping to some suburb or private school when they were saying these things. So that's why I have trouble viewing this as leadership with a capital L, but I guess it's better, perhaps better than the alternative. I realize that my presentation is over, but you might be interested in the next slide. You know, there are a lot of reasons to think that this degree of integration, yes, it was greater in the South, but was it real? Was it real in the sense that just as employers went to replace racial rules with test taking, a lot of the schools in the South replaced racial rules of classroom assignment by tracking, by AP courses or honors courses, internal. So this is based on the schools. So you might be tempted to think that desegregation of the schools really didn't amount to much economically speaking, but there is a whole series of economic studies coming out now showing dramatic positive effects. They're only coming out now because you need long-term 50-year data in order to be able to say, and I realize you may want to discuss this, and for the most part it's not my research, but as measured by things like the black high school dropout rate and occupational attainment, tracking in the labor market, and even test scores, you're getting big positive effects for African Americans in the South with no decline in white test scores or white dropout rates or anything like that. So this is another corner of my case as to how I think it was a big thing, even though we don't exactly know how this was working. The statistical association between desegregation and achievement. And I think it is hard to separate this from what was happening in the labor market because they're all happening simultaneously. And that's some of the reason that blacks had actually a lot better reason to stay in school because there were better opportunities for them if they did so.
Okay, we're quickly running out of time. We'll go through through gentlemen there. Start with Eric, and then. So go ahead.
Sorry, what's your role?
Thanks. Regarding the question of the business decision, how rational, irrational, you can back up to the 1940s, and with the fair employment debates that are taking place, many a Southern, even Northern employer are really quite honest about what they think of African Americans, and they would add two things. One, white coworkers would walk off the job if blacks are hired and or promoted. There's this grand fear of disruption on the part of white labor, and then secondly, customers and the loss of customers. So you can find in that testimony, I think, support for what you're saying. My question is a historiographical one. It's quite clear that as someone who does economic history, your arguments take very clear aim at economists who construct grand models, don't quite understand how these things come about. So the Gary Beckers and everyone else, that's clear. I'm wondering if you could say more on the historian side. Who exactly might find what you're arguing objectionable, who you're taking aim at amongst people, not in econ departments, but in history departments, because the civil rights historiography is rich, it's complicated, it's contested, and there are some, I think, who would applaud what you're doing, but others who might raise their eyebrows and say, not so fast.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm certainly trying hard not to target or denounce anybody because I really don't have a target in that area. I think maybe the Matt Lasseter, Kevin Cruz view about Atlanta, they just truncate their history much too early. On the other hand, there's a tendency to to emphasize the bleak downside of the civil rights revolution, the persistence of poverty, and the fact that, well, we may call it integration, true integration has not occurred in schools or workplace or anything. And I acknowledge all of that. I just want to say somebody needs to tell this other side. And as to who, it's not who I'm targeting, but people who I'm almost resigned to the fact that, to the idea that many African American historians and others are going to think that this is some white guy telling us we never had it so good, and why are you doing that? Because we know, well, I hope I'm not saying that. I'm certainly not denying the agenda that still lies ahead of us and the incompleteness. But I gave a talk along these lines at a conference on civil rights history of South Carolina at the Citadel, of all places. And when I got done, this one young black woman comes up and said, "Well, I'm not going to kick you in the shins," she said. Well, she said it with a smile, but I did know what she was thinking, because she was writing in something, a very different spirit. So, okay, I'm willing to be typecast to some degree, but I hope when I get it all down, it won't be as bad as it sounds.
All right. Yeah, please, either right or left. Yeah.
Just something on the tracking in the north. It's just rife here. My older son went to Bethesda Chevy Chase High School, which is wonderfully diverse at the macro level. The International Baccalaureate program had one black student. So
yes. There's a story in this morning's Washington Post about Virginia. Yeah.
What I really want to ask about, as I'm sure you know, Greensboro is the one location in the U.S. which has adopted the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission model. And I'm wondering what you think about that in terms of going back into history, understanding it better, being able to change history, change your views about history. What's your thought about as a historian?
I like the model. It's certainly it's a remarkable thing, the way the Civil Rights Revolution has been adopted as part of everybody's rhetoric, almost especially in the South. And of course, you have to wonder, well, how deep is that adoption? So I would certainly applaud efforts like that. But if you've read the recent book Hazel and Elizabeth about the two women in, excuse me, I'm corrected, Elizabeth and Hazel, and other stories about attitudes in Little Rock, where you might have thought, it's a National Historic Center, Central High School. You get a wonderful sense of atmosphere and accomplishment if you go to that school, and then you wonder, well, what are they really thinking? So I like the model. Just exactly how far you can go, I'm not sure.
All right, final question.
Does your analysis provide any indication of to what extent the Southern economy, which before 1950 certainly lagged the rest of the country, that lag was due, in fact, to segregation and these other factors we've been talking about? Vector regressions and all of that.
Not so much the lagging as of 1950, but I argue that there really was an acceleration after 1965 in the economy. Yeah, there was a catch-up. And yes, of course it was related to the racial institutions. I don't mean to say it had no relation at all. But it's a chilling fact or observation that by and large the Southern economy was making its recovery and rumbling along, and even though we can see all these inefficiencies, most of the leadership, the business leadership as well as the political leadership, didn't see that there was anything wrong or any pressing economic reason why they had to change. Their economic reasons to change were that they were getting pressure from both inside and outside the region. Oh, no, they wanted to catch up, but they thought blacks were going to be a hindrance on that. They were just as happy to see big-time black out-migration, and they were getting a lot of white in-migration at the very same time. So, that's their image of the successful. We should probably.
Okay, I think we should all give a round of applause to Kevin Wright for